Hi, my name is Pam Molosky, and the title of my session is Key Performance Indicators for Occupational Safety and Health. And I want to thank you for joining me as we talk about this important topic. I'm currently a Senior Program Director for Specialty Technical Consultants. I've been with that company for a couple of years, and we do management systems consulting and safety program development. Although I've been in the safety profession for more than 25 years, and I'm currently a member of the American Society of Safety Professionals Board of Directors. So what I'd like to talk about today is really, it's fairly simple. How did I get here? Why am I talking about this topic today? Why is it important to all of us who manage occupational safety and health programs? A little bit about what the current literature says about occupational safety and health indicators that are used to measure performance. Some considerations about whether or not we need to change it up, do something different. Maybe it's not working, maybe we can make it better. And then I'll share with you my thoughts about a new framework, a new way of looking at occupational safety and health KPIs. So you may recognize this picture. If you don't, it's Alice in Wonderland, and she's heading down the rabbit hole. And I use this when I talk about this particular topic because it's a good pictorial representation of what happened to me a couple of years ago. One of my clients approached me and said that they wanted to transition from lagging indicators to leading indicators. And I thought, well, this would be a great project because, you know, I'd been reading more about lagging indicators and how maybe they weren't the best measure of safety performance. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to really put some of that into practice. So in preparation for the project and the kickoff meeting, I started to do some reading about lagging indicators and leading indicators and occupational safety and health management and performance. And I went down a rabbit hole. And what happened to me was I came back up out of the rabbit hole after a period of time. And what I want to share with you is my journey down the hole and then back up again. So the first thing that I encountered when I started to do a little bit of digging was the lack of a real consistent use of a term for what many people call lagging indicators or leading indicators. And that was a little perplexing to me because I thought, well, everybody knows what a lagging indicator is and we all call it the same thing, and same thing with leading indicators. But my reading was that it really wasn't true. And I began to think then a little bit more about whether or not these terms were actually opposites, or were they perhaps different points on a continuum, as opposed to an organization that has one lagging indicator that they measure that sort of sits out there and a couple of leading indicators that they measure that sit out there. Was there a better way to connect these indicators together in some sort of a process or continuum so that they made more sense and worked together? And that was one of the first things that I began to think about. And then I came across the use of the terms leading and lagging indicators as primarily stemming from economics. And a leading indicator in economics is something that we see that changes before the economy starts to change. And you may remember about this time last fall, there was a lot of talk about reverse yield curves and how they predicted recessions. And so the leading indicator in economics is something that can be predictive, but some economists warned us that an inverse yield curve was not always the best predictor. It wasn't always accurate. And lagging indicators are used to change after the economy changes. Sometimes they can be predictive, but they are much better at confirming a trend or an outcome. And that outcome was the result of a process or activities that occurred in the economy. And that kind of lined up with the thinking I had from just a few minutes ago about how leading and lagging indicators were maybe part of a process. So then I began to think about why lagging indicators were so popular among occupational safety and health professionals. And a couple of things came to mind. I think, first of all, we know lagging indicators. We know how to calculate them. There's a consistent method for how they are used. And we've been using them for years and years and years. And so we've got sort of a comfort level with them. And for many years, as I mentioned earlier, we believed that a lagging indicator was an indicator of a safety performance of an organization. So low incident rates meant that the program was working and things were safe, and high incident rates indicated that there was a problem. And while that can be true, it's not always true. So we can also use lagging indicators to measure our performance and progress towards a goal. If we decide that our total recordable incident rate, TRIR, is too high, we can say we want to reduce it by 50%, and we can watch that over time, and we can see that progress. And when we meet that goal, then everybody's happy. We put time and attention and we reduce the number of injuries, and that's wonderful. But the problem is when we don't meet that goal, and the reliance on that as an absolute indicator of how we're doing with our safety program, which I'm not sure is actually correct or accurate. So more and more people are beginning to be concerned about the use of lagging indicators to measure an occupational safety and health program. And I kind of came up with and read about sort of three different areas why I think we're beginning to see some concern about that use. First of all, a lagging indicator is not necessarily aligned to the way business measures its performance. A lagging indicator is a failure of the safety program because somebody got hurt. We had a process in place to keep people from getting hurt, and that wasn't successful. But you wouldn't hear a business use a financial indicator of not losing money or a marketing indicator of not losing market share. We don't tend to measure things by the lack of something or by a failure. In addition, I think back to that historical context, safety professionals have regularly told their business executives that a lagging indicator is a good measure of occupational safety and health performance. And so what happens is when we have one failure, we have one incident, management tends to overreact to that and tends to believe that that's an indicator of the overall failure of our program. I also think that occupational safety and health professionals are not as adept at statistical analysis or using tools to really look at what's in a lagging indicator. We tend to think about it as an aggregate as opposed to really looking into that indicator to see what it means and what might be within that indicator. I'll give you an example at the end of my presentation of what I mean by that. And in some organizations that are smaller and may not have a lot of work hours to use for calculation, a one incident can skew their rate and give them lots of problems. So I thought I would expect to see an appreciation for leading indicators, an increase in the use of leading indicators. And what I discovered was maybe that wasn't true either. The Campbell Institute is an organization that's associated with the National Safety Council, and in 2013, they convened a work group of professionals and did some surveys and wrote some white papers about leading indicators. And at the very beginning of their work in 2013, their survey indicated that 93% of the people who expected to be using more leading indicators in the next 5 years. But I wasn't able to find any evidence that we were seeing an increase in the use of leading indicators. In fact, the ERM Global Safety Survey, which is done every year, 5 years later said most companies aren't using them. It's pretty dormant. So then I thought, well, what happened? If leading indicators are so good, why are we not using them more often? That same survey from the National Safety Council provided some really interesting additional information. So the folks who were surveyed ranked themselves on their expertise with leading indicators, knowing how to develop them and how to use them. And you can see the substantial portion of those folks who were surveyed rated themselves as competent, proficient, or expert, almost 80%. On the other side, however, when they were asked to rank their executives, their senior leaders, in terms of how they did with leading indicators and their expertise, you can see almost the flip. There was a good proportion that were competent, but there were a lot of executives that they considered to be either beginners or advanced beginners. So that disconnect led me to believe that maybe that's why we're not seeing as many leading indicators out there as people were expecting to see. And then that same article, the same white paper from the Campbell Institute in 2013, asked the folks in the survey, what leading indicators were they tracking? And what you see on your slide now is a sample of some of the things that they said they were tracking. And I looked at that list and I thought, well, I don't think those are leading indicators. They're really measuring a quantity of an activity, but there's really no quality measurement in that indicator. So they're really a tally. So we have a goal of 100 behavior-based safety observations in the first quarter, and we met that. Or we have a goal of 5,000 training hours in 2019, and we met that. And while that might be important that we set those goals, I think the use of the word indicator to describe something like that is really not accurate. They don't really measure any indicator of anything, and they don't really have any quality component. So when I took a look at some of those indicators, I made some adjustments into what I think are more leading indicators. So instead of the number of hours of training that an organization accomplishes in a year, let's be more interested in how much of that training is retained and used. That's a leading indicator. If I train my workforce on how to use fall protection correctly, and I go out afterwards and I notice that they're still not using it correctly, then that's an indicator that the training wasn't effective, or the flip side, that it was effective. If I have a safety committee, just having people attending meetings and getting the free coffee and donuts isn't an indicator of any kind of a leading progress towards a goal. But if that committee is involved in the activities and they take ownership for the work of the safety committee, that's a little bit more of a leading indicator. So harder to measure, absolutely, but more suitable as a leading indicator, absolutely again. And then I came across a couple of quotes from some folks in a couple of articles that I read, and I'll share a couple of them with you now. The first one is from a gentleman by the name of Anthony Hopkins, and he's a process safety expert. And he does a lot of work in performance measurement within organizations. And this was a working paper that he wrote back in 2007. But I underlined the kind of key phrases that are in there. You know, he found the same thing I found, that leading indicators and lagging indicators were not used with any consistency. But then he also said it really didn't matter what we called them. That wasn't the consequence. It was really how we used them, not so much how we called them. And I think that kind of gave me some support for some of the things I was beginning to think about in terms of using them in a process way and tying them together rather than calling them leading indicators or lagging indicators. And then I came across this quote by somebody who maybe you know, maybe you've not heard of, Fredmanuel. He's been a thought leader in the occupational safety and health profession for many, many years. And he's certainly somebody that I look up to and respect. And he wrote an article in Professional Safety, which is the magazine for the American Society of Safety Professionals. And I read the article, and he had some really critical things to say about lagging and leading. But at the very end, he said, isn't the differentiation between them gibberish? And I read that sentence a couple of times, and I said, you know, gibberish. How could something that we as occupational safety and health professionals had clung to for so many years as an important indicator of how our programs are going, as something that somebody who was a hero to me thought was gibberish? So then I began to really climb out of the rabbit hole and try to begin to put some pieces together in a way that began to make sense for me. And I came across this article that I highly recommend to you if you've not read it before. It was in the Harvard Business Review in September of 19, so just a little over a year ago. And it was called Don't Let Metrics Undermine Your Business. And the whole idea behind this article was that metrics or indicators were not used correctly, and they were causing problems in business. And they used the example of Wells Fargo and what happened to Wells Fargo as a result of this process and this problem. The chief executive officer of Wells Fargo created a metric for their customer service folks, and it was 8 is great. And the idea was that each customer of Wells Fargo should use 8 different products that Wells Fargo offered. And that the more products that the customer used, the better the customer would be. And so that number, that tally, became the most important thing, not the quality of the interaction and the quality of the products. And so for the customer service representatives, because so much emphasis was placed on 8 is great, they became very aware of the need to meet that metric. And so, as you may know, if you haven't read the article, you may know what happened to Wells Fargo. The customer service representatives signed people up for products they didn't want. Maybe they didn't understand. And eventually, in some cases, they signed them up without their permission. And so it led to a huge downfall for Wells Fargo. They lost money. Their business reputation was torn. Their CEO left. There were millions of dollars of fines. And it was all because of this process of surrogation, which is described in the article, which makes a lot of sense to me. The metric was not aligned with strategy. It made sense that we want loyal customers who like our products, but it was based purely on a number, as opposed to the quality of the products and the quality of the interaction with our customers. And the people who were involved in achieving that metric were not engaged in the development of it. And so they just went with it and decided that they were going to meet that metric no matter what the cost. So surrogation became the problem, and I think many organizations face this particular issue. So now what? So the rest of what I'm going to talk about today is some ideas behind what I think we can do differently, different changes that we can make, different frameworks or ways of viewing metrics. And then at the very end, I'm going to give you 2 examples of how I think it might work in process. And these are examples from activities that I was involved in my time. So the first one is what we just talked about, and that is avoiding surrogation. And how do we do that? Well, a couple of ways that we learned from the failures at Wells Fargo. Management has to be accountable for the indicators. Management has to be involved, and it has to be a strategic indicator as opposed to just a pure numerical indicator. And the people who are responsible to implement the process for which the indicator is being judged have to also be engaged in the process. They have to be able to participate and deliver what they think will work and give their input in those kinds of things. And so we think about management, commitment, and worker participation as the 2 key pieces of any successful occupational safety and health program. And there they are right there in those top 2 points. And then last but not least, I think incentives and indicators need to be completely separated. I think no matter how well you design an incentive program, if you tie it to an indicator, you put yourself as an organization in a position where the achievement of the indicator becomes the goal rather than the indicator themselves. And I think many organizations have had that particular problem happen. Something else that I think is important, and I've discussed this at the very beginning, and that's the sort of systems view of indicators or the process view of indicators. I've taken to describe a leading indicator as an input indicator and a lagging indicator as an output indicator, because I think they describe the inputs into the process, the things that we do to change, improve, or create a new process that's designed to improve our safety performance. And the output indicators tell us whether or not that process was successful. And so again, when we look at some examples in a few minutes, I'll give you some additional details about how I think that works. But I think that what we're talking about here is avoiding the need to keep safety indicators sort of as separate. A leading indicators over here and a lagging indicators over there, and they don't have any connection to each other. And then at the same time, they need to be connected to business performance, not safety performance. We can all agree that it's important that our workforce is safe and that they don't get hurt by doing the tasks that they need to do. That's a basic safety performance. But we have to tie it to business performance, not just safety, because that allows us to integrate safety performance into the business's strategic goals and into the business's strategic KPIs. Many organizations, and including ones that I've worked for, as we're developing the strategic plan, somebody goes to the safety director and says, you know, what do you want your KPIs to be? And those KPIs get developed and sent up the chain, and the executive team looks at them and adds them, and the next thing you know, they're part of the strategic plan. But there really hasn't been any integration between the 2 or any work together between the 2 groups. And then my friend Peter Suska, who does a lot of management systems consulting and business performance, flips Stephen Covey's habit of beginning with the end in mind. And he says, when it comes to measuring performance, we want to end with the beginning in mind. So we're not just looking at results, those output indicators, we're actually looking at what happens before and during the indicator. So again, tying them all together so that our performance is connected to the strategic goals of the business. So let me spend the rest of my time together giving you a couple of examples of how this might work. And these are examples from either my work as a safety director or my work with other clients. So the first one was a client that I worked with who had been doing very well developed incident investigations for injuries, illnesses, property damage, and even near hits. And over and over again, they were deciding that the management of change process that they had in place was not working, and that it was often a cause of the actual incident, that it had either been not used at all when it should have been to identify emerging risks and hazards, or it wasn't used properly. And so they decided that one way to reduce incidents was to have an effective management of change process. Not just to reduce incidents, but what was tied up with the ability to do so, in their opinion, was an effective management of change process. And so their goal was to improve the awareness and the accuracy of the use of management of change, because they discovered that that was a problem, that that process was the problem, not the outcome, not the input, but the process was the problem. And so as input indicators, they chose a number of things. First of all, they developed and revised their policy, their whole process for management of change, when it got used, how it was documented. They just really took a whole review and revisit of that process and redid that. And when they redid that, they then trained everybody on that, but not just trained them, they confirmed their retention of it in a variety of different post-training activities and surveys and methods. And then as the process was rolled out, they began to monitor the use of management of change to confirm that the policy was being implemented the way it was supposed to be implemented. And then they went through a year of the management of change process being revised and used, and discussed and developed some output indicators, which would give them some indication of whether or not what they did strategically was working. And again, those output indicators were not necessarily tied to incident reduction directly, but they believed that if they could achieve a 90% correct use of management of change, that would begin upstream strategically to reduce incidents, because more emerging hazards would be identified through process changes or equipment changes or things that changed the way they were doing it, which is why we would use management of change. And as a result of that, they also expected to see a 90% reduction in incident investigations where management of change was identified as a cause of the incident. Now, what they eventually found over time, it took about a year to 18 months, was that they did begin to see overall reduction in incidents. But that was not necessarily the end all and be all goal, because they believed if management of change could be properly implemented, that would lead to a reduction in incidents. This next example is a little bit more tied to an actual strategic goal of a business. And this was a company that I used to work with. We did environmental field services for our clients. And if you think about that, you might think about a wetland delineation or a habitat survey or a pipeline survey, or perhaps an energy company is looking to relocate a transmission line and they need to make sure that the northern harrier is not using that area as a migration path. And so we had a lot of folks who did that work, and they were very good biologists and herpetologists and geologists and architectural historians. And we did really well with that. Our clients liked our work. And so our business unit director decided that they wanted to increase our gross revenues for that type of work by 25%. The problem was in our TRIR, which was a little bit higher than it should have been, within there was a number that those clients would reject us because we didn't meet their benchmark. Our TRIR was too high to work with these clients, or we had to jump through a lot of hoops in order to get them to allow us to submit proposals to do work for them. So as we understood what our business unit director wanted to do, we took a look at our TRIR and said, if we don't get that TRIR down, that's going to jeopardize that goal. And within that TRIR, we found that our environmental field service staff were frequently having recordable injuries because of soft tissue injuries. So they would slip, trip, and fall, and they would bump their head or twist their arm or bump their knee or sprain an ankle. And they didn't know whether they should seek medical treatment. And so they would ask their team members, or they would ask their team lead, or they would ask me as the safety director, should I go to the doctor or not? And I'm not a medical personnel, and neither were any of those other folks. And so what often happened is, out of an abundance of caution, they would go to a medical clinic and they would end up with an OSHA recordable. And we decided that if we had good medical expertise advising these employees about their injury, they might be better able to decide whether medical treatment was needed or whether they could take care of that injury on their own. And so our insurance carrier helped us identify what's called a medical triage service, which are medical personnel that help evaluate injuries and make determinations on whether medical care is needed or not. Now, keep in mind, we're not talking about situations where we're trying to divert people from getting care if they need it, just giving them the expertise that they needed. So we decided to try that as a strategy. And our input indicators were a number of criteria that we established for identifying our vendors and picking a vendor. We developed protocols for how employees would use that vendor. We trained them, and then we communicated that to them and monitored that process of making sure they understood what to do. And then we implemented the use of this vendor. So our output indicators were that staff were satisfied with the service. We believed that if the staff felt that they got good medical advice, that they were steered for medical treatment when they needed it and self-care when they didn't, that the word would get out and people would continue to use it. So every time somebody used the medical triage vendor, we would call that employee and ask them a series of questions. We also looked at times in which people were using the protocols correctly, as well as when they weren't using the protocols correctly, to try to tease out what may have happened with the protocol implementation and what might need to change as a result of that. And then last but not least, we were looking for a 25% decrease in soft tissue recordables. Not TRIR in total, but that small subset of TRIR types of injuries that were related to the lack of good medical advice on whether you needed a medical care or not. And at the end of 1 year, we evaluated the program and we decided that we had seen 8 different minor injuries, soft tissue, that had been diverted for medical care satisfactorily on the part of the employees. And as a result of that subset going down, our TRIR went down and ultimately went to a point where we were better able to work with the clients in that particular type of service. So again, we focused upstream on the strategic business goal of increasing gross revenues, identified the problem from the occupational safety and health performance with meeting that goal, and developed a activity, a process for making that happen. So again, it kind of takes you to, again, upstream process, connecting leading and lagging indicators, and then avoiding surrogation. So that's the end of my presentation. I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope that what I've provided for you is some things that you can think about in terms of how your organization may be using indicators, as well as how you might be able to improve or change the way you're doing so. So once again, thank you for attending today.